When we started, meditation was not cool. It was very uncool, ultra uncool. Now it's ultra cool. And we want to talk about that arc, how that happened. But before we do, we thought we'd try it. Over to you.
So we thought we'd start with a little practice. By the way, how many of you have participated in G-Pause? Almost all of you. Okay, wonderful. That's great. So let's start by bringing our awareness into our bodies. You can sit with your eyes closed or open, whatever feels most comfortable, and finding a posture that's dignified but relaxed, sitting with an upright spine, and bringing our awareness to the present moment and checking in with ourselves. What might you be sensing in your body? Pleasant, unpleasant, neutral sensation. Bringing awareness to the body and recognize this extraordinary quality that we have to be aware, which really is in many ways the essence of these practices. And as we sense our grounding, feeling our feet on the floor, our sit bones on our seats, reflecting for a few moments on our motivation for being here, recognizing that these are practices which can be helpful in calming our minds and opening our hearts, not just for ourselves, but even more importantly for all of the other beings that we touch throughout our days. And so let's spend a few moments steeping ourselves in this altruistic motivation and reflecting on how a calm presence and a warm heart can be so helpful for all of our interactions. And so just spending a few moments bringing our awareness to different parts of our body and using the sensations in our body as support for recognizing this basic quality of awareness. And let's also spend a few moments reflecting on our intentions for the work that we are all engaged with, work that depends upon so many other people, leaning into a sense of gratitude and appreciation for all those who contribute to the work that we do and the benefits that are enabled by our work. And finally, in these last few moments, one of the ways in which some traditions organize a meditation session is to reflect on our intention as we did at the beginning, and then to have a period of practice, and then in the closing moments to dedicate whatever merit, whatever benefit may have been derived from our practice, we dedicate it to the welfare of others. And so spending a few moments reflect on how the kind of calm demeanor that we can taste and open-hearted can bring benefit to others. Now for those whose eyes are closed, we can open them, but maintain that same quality of awareness as we bring ourselves back. And thank you all so much.
So that's what we're talking about here. And our story begins in India. Is that okay? Yeah. I somehow wangled a pre-doctoral traveling fellowship from Harvard to go to India and hang out with yogis and swamis and lamas. I was particularly interested in a yogi named Neem Karoli Baba. He was well known in those days as Ram Dass's guru, the mysterious yogi in the blanket. And I tracked him down. I've been studying clinical psychology at Harvard. Clinical psychology is the art of figuring out what's wrong with anyone. Neem Karoli Baba was all about what could be right with people. He embodied ongoing presence, unconditional love, totally relaxed, happy, joyous, and he was contagious. There's someone who used to be here at Google. He's not here anymore. His name's Larry Brilliant. He was there too. And Larry put it very well. He said, the miracle wasn't that he loved us unconditionally. The miracle was that we loved each other unconditionally when we were with him. He just radiated this aura, and it was contagious. And I met a few other beings like that. I went back to Harvard. I said, hey, you know what? There's an upside to human potential. And they said, we don't care, except for one person who is now sitting right next to me.
So I entered the picture as a beginning graduate student at Harvard, and this was in the days before the internet. Dan had published a few very obscure papers in a journal by the name of the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology.
It was published right here.
Yeah, it's a journal not with a very high citation impact. But nevertheless, I was probably one of about 8 people on the planet who read these articles of Dan's.
4 of them were relatives of mine.
So I knew that Dan was a graduate student at Harvard doing this stuff, and actually that was one of my motivations for going there as a graduate student, although I kept that very subterranean. I didn't tell the faculty who were interviewing me that one of my attractions was this crazy graduate student named Dan Goleman. But I attended my very first class. It was late afternoon, and I sat down, and there's a guy who sat next to me in this class, and I'd never seen a picture of him before, and I turned and looked at him, and I said, "You're Dan Goleman." Now, it's not because I have any well-cultivated psychic powers. It's because Dan looked like he just came back from India.
So the giveaway was this. I owned one pair of pants. They'd been made in India. They were wide whale purple corduroy pajamas. And I think that was a clue.
That was a clue.
That was a clue, yeah.
So then it went on from there. So Dan said, well, would you like a ride back to your place? And my apartment was just a few blocks from William James Hall, but I said, sure. So we walk to his vehicle, which was a VW microbus, popular in those days. I get into this vehicle, and plastered from floor to ceiling were pictures of yogis and holy people. And it just completely blew my mind. And I had the beginning sense that this was going to be an important source of my alternative education. So that's how it began. And then Dan was able to finagle yet another fellowship to go back to Asia a couple of years later. And at that time, I was finishing my second year as a graduate student. And I decided that I needed to get a firsthand taste of this stuff. And so, much to the consternation of the Harvard psychology faculty, I went off to Asia for several months. Many thought I would never return. I was pretty sure I would. But for part of that summer, Dan and I were living together in Kandy, Sri Lanka. And we were hanging out with a forest monk, Jnana, who was one of the experts on mindfulness in this region.
In those days, he had published the only book in the English language that had the word mindfulness in the title. It's called The Power of Mindfulness.
That was a major motivation for us. And that summer, we wrote together, Dan and I wrote together, the beginnings of what would become a lifelong journey together. And we wrote an article for another very obscure journal. And we had a sentence that we wrote in that article, which ended up being a very prescient sentence that we came back to many times since we wrote it. And we weren't quite sure exactly what it meant at the time, but I'll tell you what the sentence was. The sentence was this: the after is the before for the next during. I'll say it again.
It's not going to help, Richie. You can say it again.
The after is the before for the next during. So what does this mean? Well, the during is about what happens when you meditate. What happens on the chair, on the cushion. That's the state effects. The after are the lingering consequences. Now, when we put our butt on the cushion or on a chair and meditate, it's not for this experience we have when we're meditating that we're doing this. It's for the impact it has on every nook and cranny of everyday life. And that's what we mean by the after. And so when we say the after is the before for the next during, the after becomes the new baseline. It becomes the new default. And it becomes the new before for the next time we meditate. And those cycles, when they accumulate over time, are what is the key ingredient to instantiating a trait. And a trait is something that sticks, a quality that endures. And this is why we engage in these practices.
We should say at this point, it was a huge speculation. The reason is that the theoretical and empirical scaffolding for this did not exist. That's the idea of neuroplasticity. That was actually discovered decades later. So we're making a kind of a lucky guess. We'll call it a smart guess. Smart guesses are lucky guesses in retrospect.
So that's really where all this began. And at the time that we started, there were actually 3 scientific articles that had been published on meditation. One by Kazumatsu and Hirai on 3 Japanese Zen meditators. The second article by Anand et al., an Indian scientist, on some Indian yogis.
No, one yogi in samadhi, and he put a hot test tube on him, and nothing happened, according to Anand.
Right. And then the third article was an article by Keith Wallace and colleagues on transcendental meditation. That was the sum total of the empirical literature on meditation when we began.
However, despite the advice to the contrary of our mentors and professors at Harvard, we decided to add to that literature. And we each did our dissertation on meditation. However, now that we've written this book, there are 6,000, more than 6,000 peer review articles on meditation. There are more than 1,000 a year now. Our research, we use very rigorous standards. We boiled 6,000 down to 60. Our research didn't make the cut, did it?
No.
Our early research, his research does.
Not the early stuff.
Yeah.
No. And so we, in the book, one of the key things that we describe is what happens at different levels of practice. And so when we began the serious scientific research on meditation, we actually began on the far end of the continuum. And we did that because we were urged by His Holiness the Dalai Lama to please study the minds and the brains of practitioners who've spent years training their mind to investigate using modern, sophisticated neuroscientific methods what might be different. And so that was where all this began. And for a couple of years, we flew practitioners from India, Nepal, Bhutan, and a few from France who were living in a retreat center in southern France. And they came to Madison, and we probed and interrogated their brains and their bodies in many different ways to see initially if there was a there. And we decided to start at this point because if we didn't see anything in these really long-term practitioners, it would be unlikely that we can use the same tools and investigate ranked beginners. And so that was the original strategy. And it was a strategy that really paid off because we saw a number of things that were very unusual in these long-term practitioners. Now, let me say that these are professional meditators. They meditate as their full-time gig. So the average lifetime practice of these individuals is about 34,000 hours.
I think we should explain the different levels. So we see meditation as falling into different baskets. The first is the hardcore professionals, like these yogis that are flown over. They live in a culture that supports people to just meditate. They're professionals, they're monks, they're nuns, they're yogis. They do it all the time, and these cultures understand the value of that. So they get very deep in practice, but a very small proportion of people actually do it at that level. Then there's one level out, how these practices are brought to the West. For example, I don't know if you know Spirit Rock up in Marin, which is a traditional Vipassana Theravada meditation practice, which has been exported. It's been taken out of the cultural context. A lot of things get left behind, but it's adapted so that it's more accessible to us, to Westerners. So you may not go as deep, that's an open question, I suspect not, but many, many more people will have the experience. Then there's a further remove, which actually the Dalai Lama urged Richie to kick off. He said to him at one point, our tradition has many methods for managing destructive emotions. Take them out of the cultural and religious context, test them rigorously in the lab, and if they're of benefit to people, spread them widely. And that's the third level. It's methods like mindfulness that have been brought to scale. So anybody can do it, but you don't have to have a particular belief system. You don't have to have a particular cultural attitude. And those three tranches, if you will, are the subject of different levels of the research that's been done.
Yeah.
So you're back to the yogis.
So back to the yogis. Let me just give you two examples of findings from the yogis that are particularly striking. One is, and this is actually the subject of the very first paper we published, which was published in 2004, and it came out in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and it was the first time a paper on meditation had ever appeared in that journal. And it was, if you look at a graph of the publication numbers, the number of publications per year in meditation or mindfulness, you'll see an inflection point in 2000. There's a very noticeable inflection point, and that we think has to do with this initial paper coming out, basically showing that there was a there, and it helped catalyze a lot of research.
I thought it was my book, Destructive Emotion. We'll talk later.
Your book, Destructive Emotions, what year did it come out?
Around then.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter.
They both played an important
role. He was such a diplomat. And, he's gotten much better since he's been a meditator. I knew him back then. And my wife says, I've gotten nicer too, by the way. That's the metric that counts.
And those are the best unobtrusive measures, getting reports from significant others around you. And we'll tell some stories about that. So back to the yogis, we put EEG electrodes on them. And one of the things that we found, which was very, very unusual, and it took us about a year to run all these control studies to convince ourselves that this was actually for real, is we saw very pronounced gamma oscillations. Gamma oscillations can be recorded from the scalp surface using brain electrical measures, but typically in the average brain, they are seen for very short periods of time, typically less than 1 second, most often around 1/4 of a second. And these oscillations appear when there is a particular insight that you may have. So if you're engaged in a problem and a solution emerges just spontaneously and very quickly, you will see a burst of gamma at that point. And there are experimental studies.
I think Google runs on these bursts.
We call it intellepsy. So there you see that kind of thing in normal untrained people, but in the yogis, we see it going on for seconds and minutes. That was really unusual. And we had to rule out all kinds of alternative explanations, which we had to do for this to get this in a high profile journal. And subsequently, it's been replicated by a number of other people. And interesting, in some other work that we've done with practitioners who are not as advanced, but still are long-term practitioners, but more like those with day jobs, we see the presence of gamma oscillations even during sleep, which may be indicative of a kind of residual strand of awareness that persists throughout sleep. So that's one unusual finding. The second finding is something that I think we all can relate to. It was a study that we did on pain, on physical pain. And using strong stimuli of this sort is one effective way to challenge and probe the mind and the brain. It's kind of like a cardiologist using a cardiac stress test, look at cardiovascular function. We were using a sort of mental stress test to look at the mind and the brain, and we can do this with physical pain. So we use a device that neurologists use to test temperature, and it's a device that's compatible for the MR scanning environment, and it's a very thin metal plate that gets strapped to the ulnar area, which is very sensitive. And we have very rapidly circulating water that goes through there, and we can regulate the temperature of the water very, very precisely. And the temperature of the water for this is at 49 degrees centigrade, around 107-ish degrees Fahrenheit. And we have this stimulus on for 10 seconds. And most people can take it for a few seconds, but after the 4th or 5th second, it's pretty excruciating. But we can adjust it so that it's just below the threshold for producing tissue damage. So we can deliver it quite safely. And so here's the experiment. We give people a zap of this so they know what it feels like. And then in the experiment, we give them a cue, for example, a tone, which denotes that in 10 seconds, they will get zapped with this pain. So there's an anticipation period that begins with the tone, which is 10 seconds. They then have 10 seconds of pain. And then they have 10 seconds that we call a recovery period, which is simply 10 seconds after the thermal stimulus goes off. Now, if you take an average person off the street who has no mind training, and you give them an initial taste of the pain, you then put them in the experiment and present the tone, which tells them that they're getting the painful stimulus in 10 seconds. In response to the tone alone, virtually the entire pain matrix of the brain activates. So it's as if they're experiencing the pain in response to the tone. And it's dramatic. And so, they show that, they then get the pain matrix continues its activation, and then during the recovery period, they're still activated. They are still reverberating and ruminating about the painful stimulus, and what you then end up seeing is they're essentially getting a triple dose of the pain during these 3 blocks. You take the long-term practitioners and you present the tone, and you see activation of the auditory cortex. That is, they heard the tone.
No pain matrix?
Virtually no pain matrix. It's really flat. In response to the painful stimulus itself, they actually show significantly heightened activation compared to controls in the sensory regions of the brain. So if you look at somatosensory cortex, for example, they actually show greater activation in that region compared to the controls. And then in a recovery period, they come right back down to baseline. So it's a very sharp inverted V-shaped function. And among the control, they're showing this very flat, highly activated across all 3 periods. And the anticipation, the recovery period actually accounts for a very significant amount of the variance in reports of distress. And so this is something quite practical and one of the most dramatic differences that we see.
You know, there was another one. I happened to see the first subject run. I was there in the fMRI control room. And for statistical analysis reasons, the subject was asked, the person in the human cigar tube, the fMRI, the MRI, was asked to do the following. We'd like you to do a concentration practice for 90 seconds, 90 seconds, and then you'll hear a tone, stop for 60, then do it again for 90, and then stop, and like 4 times, and then 3 different kinds of meditation. I don't know about you, but when I sit down to meditate, it takes a while for my mind to actually focus on the meditation. There's a saying in Tibet, at first it's like a waterfall. They're talking about the mind and thoughts. Then it becomes like a river, and then finally it's like a lake. But these people all went to the lake immediately. There's this amazing mental agility that goes along with it. So I don't know if you ever published that, but I think that's important too.
Yeah, no, it's really important. And by their reports, they're able to do this and their brain changes instantaneously.
But what about people right at the beginning? Let's talk about that. So let's say you're just starting this for the first time. You're not like a professional yogi, but it's kind of interesting. What happened with beginners is really telling. The benefits start from the get-go. One of the things that you see, for example, is how it impacts multitasking. I don't know that that happens here at Google, but other places I understand. So multitasking, of course, means you're working on that one thing, that really important thing you have to do today. You're very absorbed. Your concentration is like here. Then you think, oh, I better check do you have some like income? What's your
email?
No, but there's a special
Email.
email. Okay, you have to check your email. People on average check their emails more than 70 times a day. You do your email. Well, then you have to answer the email. Then you have to look at that other email. Then there's your text, and then there's your this and that and that. Then you go back to that original thing. Your concentration was up here. Now it's down here. And it takes a while to ramp up again. The brain does not operate in parallel. It switches rapidly, and you lose concentration unless you did 10 minutes of mindfulness. Turns out that 10 minutes of mindfulness mitigates that loss of concentration. If you do it 3 times during the day, you're covered for the day, it seems. So that's something really handy. Attention gets better, handling stress gets better. So, and I'm talking about like the stuff of life. Life is stress. So in ordinary, when we get stressed, the amygdala and circuitry around the amygdala is a trigger point for the fight or flight or freeze response. So the amygdala gets triggered and stress hormones flood the body, and the recovery time, the time from peak of that to calm again, is operational definition of resilience. It gets shorter, and the longer you've been a meditator, the shorter it gets. The less often you're triggered, and when you do get triggered, you don't get triggered as much. It doesn't become as high in terms of stress hormone levels and so on. And then the third impact, which is really interesting, has to do with a meditation called loving kindness, which is traditionally done at the end of a mindfulness session. In loving kindness, I think you actually did a kind of loving kindness. You think about not just yourself, but people you love, people you know, strangers, a widening circle, and you wish them well. You wish yourself well, and you wish everybody else well, that they be safe and happy and healthy and so on. And it turns out that, which is really more cognitive, it's not just trying to keep your attention in one place and bring it back when it wanders. That's the basic repetition in most meditation. This is a mental exercise, is almost attitudinal, but it has remarkable effects on the biology and on the brain. For one thing, the mammalian circuitry for parental love, a parent's love for a child, becomes stronger. People become more likely to notice when someone else needs help and actually help them. People get more generous. So at the beginning level, just doing, say, 8 weeks, half-hour a day, 15 minutes, whatever, it does have an impact.
And then, one of the other findings with the loving kindness that's so interesting and important in our kind of national scene today particularly is a reduction in implicit bias. And so implicit bias is a kind of unconscious bias that is assessed with more objective means. So a person can fill out a questionnaire, and on the questionnaire you can report that you have no bias against various kinds of outgroups. But on these implicit measures, many people still show evidence of some bias. And what's been found is that even short amounts of loving kindness practice have lingering effects in reducing implicit bias.
Hey, that might be relevant to the diversity program.
I think it might be.
It might be, okay. I just wanted to drop that hint here. So then there are the mid-range. So how many people here who are meditators have been doing it? Okay, these findings apply to you, to us. I'm in that category too. What are they?
So with middle range meditators, here is where we begin to see evidence of trait effects. And by trait effects, we mean that the baseline is now different. And so using various kinds of indices, we see evidence of changes in the brain and in the body which do not depend upon being in a meditation state itself, but rather represent enduring changes, both in the brain and the body, as well as in behavior. So let me give you one example of that in the realm of behavior, which turns out to be quite important. There is a phenomenon known as the attentional blink. And the attentional blink is seen when a series of rapid stimuli are presented and you're asked to look for a particular kind of stimulus, and you notice one instance of that. And if a second instance occurs in a closely spaced point in time, you will not notice it. You'll be unconscious. Your attention will blink. And scientists have regarded the attentional blink as a kind of refractory period of the mind.
Wait a minute, don't you mean like spacing out?
Spacing out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This happens to us all the time. So basically your attention wanders. I remember talking to one guy who said, when I'm in a business meeting and my mind wanders, I wonder what opportunity did I just miss? Or if you're someone that you happen to be in love with, and your attention wanders, what emotional cue did you just miss?
Yeah.
That's what this is about, really.
Right. And so, if you stop to notice cues, for example, during interpersonal interaction, whether it's with a partner, with a team member, there's an enormous amount of information that gets transmitted very quickly in a given unit of time. And our ability to function effectively depends upon us picking up on those cues. And if we can reduce the attentional blink, we will be noticing more stuff. And it turns out that the attentional blink is significantly reduced among people who are doing longer-term meditation practice. And it does not depend upon being in a meditation state. That is, it is a lingering trait effect. So this is, in the domain of attention, we probably have some of the very best evidence that these effects endure.
But isn't that kind of like a no-brainer? Because meditation of any kind reduces to attention training. I mean, other things go on. But for example, if you're doing mindfulness of the breath, your contract with yourself is, I'm going to keep my attention, my focus on the breath. But the mind wanders. Maybe you're familiar with the famous study at Harvard where they gave people an app that rang their phone at random times a day and asked 3 questions. What are you doing? What are you thinking? How do you feel? Well, if what you're thinking doesn't match what you're doing, your mind is wandering. And they use this to get a metric for how frequently it wanders and in what situations, and also the mood it puts you in. So the mind on average wanders 90% of the time during commutes, right? You know that. When you're, the next year, I'm a little sorry to say, when you're looking at a video monitor, this is for other people, not Googlers. And when you're at work, 90% of the time for most people, not here, but for most people. It's only 10% of the time during romantic moments. Wait a minute, who answers an app at a moment like that? I think that data maybe we'll put aside. And then the general take home is that the more your mind wanders, the less happy you are, because the mind tends to wander to problems we're having, problems in relationships, particularly that email. You're 2 in the morning, you're thinking about, why did she send me that email? Why did I send her that email? But that happened 2 weeks ago and we're still thinking about it. So in other words, the mind ruminates. But when you meditate, your contract is, I'm going to bring it back every time it wanders off. So you focus on the breath, mind wanders, you notice it wandered, bring it back. That's the mental equivalent of going to a gym and lifting weights. Every time you lift the weight for a rep, your muscle gets that much stronger. And what you're doing here is amping up attentional circuitry.
Yeah. So maybe we should take questions now. So we have 15 minutes or so.
I had 2 questions today. The first one is just a quick clarifier on the yogi that you said, or the yogis that could handle the anticipatory.
Could you hold the mic closer to your mouth?
Yeah, the anticipatory pain response. Were they primed to be in a meditative state before? Okay. And then my second question, this is maybe a little more general. It really is out of curiosity of your guys' experience, bringing meditation from an Eastern place and taking it to the West. I know here in the West, we all often use timers to help us bound the time between when we enter the practice and get out of the practice. And I'm curious to know if that is heavily more Western, or if you found that, are there timers like within temples, if you will, with people?
Okay, so when I lived in India 2 years, I never saw a timer. They may not have been invented then, but I think it's a typically Western thing. For one thing, I hung out with Tibetans. In old Tibet, among nomads, there were 2 times a day. They lived in kind of yurts, and they had a fire in the middle, they had a hole, and so the smoke would leave the yurt, in the middle of the yurt. So one time was before the sun hits the fire, and the other time was after the sun hits the fire. In other words, being so pressed for time is a uniquely Western condition, particularly in these traditional cultures.
Yeah, I feel like I can't really meditate unless I have a timer, because I'm anticipating that I'm going to just like get lost in it or something, and I'm going to lose track of time.
Well, I think it's good. A timer is fine because you don't have to like peek at a watch or something to see what time it is. I've used timers too, just not in the Asian culture.
I have a question actually about the Center of Healthy Minds. So can you share a little bit more about what you're doing there and how that's impacting well-being in the workplace and what we can learn about it?
Sure. Thanks for asking, Rachel. So our center at the University of Wisconsin-Madison is called the Center for Healthy Minds, and we have 3 major pathways. One is a research pathway, which is kind of our core DNA, and we do both basic research as well as translational research in field settings. We also have 2 other pathways. One is an innovation pathway, where we're committed now to being activist scientists. Our mission, by the way, of the center is to cultivate well-being and relieve suffering through a scientific understanding of the mind. That's our mission statement. And in the innovation pathway, we formed a nonprofit corporation, partnered with our center, where we are developing products and services to bring out into the world that are based on our research. And so one of the things that we're doing, a major kind of signature project, is to develop a comprehensive digital platform to cultivate, revising it so that we have versions for different sectors. And it's not a mindful program, it includes mindfulness, but it has 4 modules. One is called awareness, a second is called connection, which is really about kindness, compassion, appreciation. The third is insight, which is focused on cultivating insight, particularly into how the self works, what a healthy relationship is to the narrative that we carry around in our minds about ourselves. And the 4th module we call purpose, and it's focused on helping an individual to identify their core meaning and purpose in life, and most importantly, to align their everyday behavior with what that purpose is. And we also have a suite of assessment tools that will be implemented on mobile devices that will enable the measurement of each of these 4 modules. That is, measuring the specific constructs that are impacted by each of these 4 modules. And the measurements are in 4 categories. One is questionnaires, which are obvious. The second is experience sampling of the sort that Dan described in that Harvard study. The third are neuroscientifically grounded behavioral tasks. So they are tasks that measure reaction time and accuracy that are implemented on a mobile device that will enable measurement of different aspects of attention, empathic accuracy, generosity with economic decision-making tasks, and so forth, all of which have been studied in generated data. That is data using GPS coordinates to help an individual understand where their well-being may be particularly high, where it may be particularly not so good, and also to provide information on social media use and doing some initially simple content analyses of the content of social media, particularly, for example, the use of personal pronouns. I, we, they turns out to be very diagnostic. And also emotion adjectives, pleasant, unpleasant, for example, are things that we can easily capture. So this is a work in progress. IDEO has partnered with us as a design firm to help design the key aspects of the user interface. And we will be doing some pilot testing of this and rolling it out beginning in January. So that's our innovation pathway. And let me just say very briefly, the third pathway is our movement pathway. We believe that we are part of a social movement. And the simplest way to capture it is the movement is about changing the cultural meme around the simple idea that well-being can be cultivated.
How do you regard a meditation or stillness practice with emotional intelligence or emotional awareness?
Oh, the relationship between meditation practice and emotional
Yeah,
intelligence.
like for example, one could argue that if you're on a mountaintop for many decades, that may not necessarily invest in your ability to be in relationship with people, hypothetically. So.
Okay, I think there is an indirect way in which elements of emotional intelligence are definitely boosted by meditation practice. I think your point about having no relationships at all is well taken, because that's the arena in which you would probably display and experience emotional intelligence. But for example, there are four main components the way I look at it. There's self-awareness, using that awareness to manage yourself better, either positive motivations, positive outlook, and so on, or handling stress better. The third is empathy, bringing this to your relationships and sensing what other people are feeling, and then putting that all together to have positive relationships. And I can see a very definite way in which the experimental literature points to how the first two are boosted by mindfulness practice, by meditation, your ability to introspect. I mean, it's training and looking within, and then to use that to manage yourself better in many ways. On the other hand, and probably to extend that to empathy. On the other hand, I don't think that it does the whole trick. I think that I have a model of 12 competencies that are nested in each of those four domains. For example, persuasion and influence, or conflict management, or a positive outlook. They might be helped to some extent, like to listen to books instead of read books, and it may be people who are seeing this on screen. This is available as an audiobook from Keystep Media. Keystep Media also has primers on each of the 12 emotional intelligence competencies. You could look at those and decide for yourself which meditation helps a lot, a little, or not so much.
And Dan himself read the book, so an added benefit.
It's my maleficent voice on it.
I heard a study on NPR where they were studying unconsciousness when you take certain kinds of drugs, anesthesia, to put you out. And they said there's a wave that goes back and forth, a very long wave that just oscillates back and forth through the brain. And I was seeing that in terms of your gamma bursts, and also in terms of like how, I know this is kind of a field, but how consciousness works. So if the mind just has lots of different centers that are constantly communicating with each other, and that's what it is to be conscious, how does meditation affect that and that communication?
Answering that question really deeply would require a lot of time, but let me give you a few tidbits. One of the things that we see when we see these gamma oscillations is not simply their elevated presence, but we also see a striking synchrony. So if you look at the phase relationship of these gamma oscillations across widespread regions of the brain, you can compute a metric of synchrony based on the phase, and it turns out that these gamma oscillations are highly synchronized across the brain. So it's not simply that they're elevated, but they're also highly synchronized. And the amplitude and the synchrony are not necessarily correlated. They're not always correlated. In these practitioners, they're highly correlated. And so the synchrony, we think, is as a metric of brain connectivity has been intensively investigated in the basic neuroscience literature, and it is indicative of increased communication among brain regions. And so the way these practitioners describe phenomena, their experience, it's a kind of panoramic awareness. It's a very broad panoramic field that they report in their experience. The stuff you mentioned about anesthesia is associated with pronounced delta oscillations, which are very low frequency. And one of the really intriguing things is, I alluded to this earlier, it's a published study. You can get all our publications, our scientific publications. They're available free on our website. But one of the things that you see in experienced meditation practitioners is gamma oscillations superimposed upon these delta rhythms during deep sleep. It's the first time anyone has ever seen gamma oscillations during deep sleep. And it may be indicative of these highly experienced practitioners often report that even when they're sleeping, they never completely lose awareness.
Tell about the Dalai Lama.
Story, I was with the Dalai Lama a few years ago when he was about to undergo some minor surgery. And we were just chatting. And he said to me that he's concerned about one thing about the surgery. And I asked him what that was. And he said, this will be the first time in his life that he is unconscious.
Meaning he has awareness even when he sleeps.
Yes.
Hi there. I have two questions, hopefully quick. The first one, Dr. Goleman, you said that one of the benefits of meditation is recovery time for an amygdala trigger is reduced.
Yes.
Does it also change the threshold at which the amygdala is triggered?
I did say that.
Okay. And
You
then
said it better, but I did say that.
okay. And the second question was, how often and for how long do the two of you meditate?
Yeah, there's some evidence to indicate that the threshold changes, but that's still very much preliminary, I would say, at this point in time.
Second question was, how much do we meditate?
Yes.
You mean for how many years have we meditated? Or
No,
not?
your practice, daily,
Oh, it depends
hourly?
on the day. Some days not a lot, and some days a lot. For me, I don't know about Richie.
For me, like anywhere between a half hour and a couple hours.
We're like hardcore, though. You know.
Hardcore what?
Meditator.
I also have two questions. And my first question is the meditation only useful to a certain type of person? Another question is, can we do other activity and do meditation together? For example, my friend told me when she's driving, she was doing the meditation while studying the license plate of the front car.
When she's driving?
Ah.
Yeah. Yeah, so those are great questions, really great questions. And let me address the second part of your question first. We don't really know from a hardcore scientific perspective whether engaging in meditation practice while you're doing something else, so to speak, is as effective as simply sitting and doing meditation in the more conventional way. In this digital platform, this Healthy Minds program that we're building, we actually give a person an option, because we've heard this from so many people that the very idea of taking another minute out of the day to do something to reduce their stress will increase their stress. And so what we say is that that's fine. You actually don't need to take even a minute out of your day. What you should do is simply identify an activity of daily living that's non-cognitively demanding in which you regularly engage. It could be commuting, it could be doing your laundry, washing the dishes, whatever it might be. And during that activity, you can engage in a practice. But we don't know, there isn't any data at this point. There aren't any data that speak to whether practice in that way is as effective. Maybe it's 70% as effective. We just don't know. We are studying that now. And the first question you asked is whether meditation is for all people. There are hundreds of different kinds of meditation. And one of the things that we often say is that one size does not fit all. And so, but I will tell you what the very best kind of meditation is to do. So are you ready? This is really the best. The very best kind of meditation, based on everything we know, is the meditation that you actually do,
Well
whatever
said.
that might be.
Thank you. We are out of time, but thank you so much, Dr. Goleman, Dr. Davidson.
Thank you.